Hi, I'm Tom Burgess, and you're listening to The Real Agenda, the podcast for political change. Welcome to the latest episode of our monthly American edition of The Real Agenda. Today we're going to be talking about income inequality, why it's got so extreme, and what we can do about it. If we can tackle extreme income inequality, we can go some way to tackling wealth inequality, which is even more extreme. So this episode could be about people earning too much, but earning is really the wrong word. So who determines what is the value of the work you do and its contribution to society? This episode is more about taking too much and then using that to invest in appreciating assets and spend it extravagantly, so extracting it out of circulation. Now, if those funds went to lower earners, it would be spent in the economy to provide a better and more secure life, creating jobs, boosting growth and funding public services. So who says whose job is more valuable? Are the big bosses in corporations more valuable to society? Surely it's the teachers, healthcare workers, energy services, transportation, retail and hospitality workers that do the grunt work and hold up the economy. Some of the wages in these sectors are not even enough to live on, and yet those that control the corporations are effectively helping themselves to the money pot. During my 7 years in the USA and being involved in politics, you realise how much of it is based on money, lots of it, whereas it seems the amount of money that is raised for the never-ending elections is more important than the policies. And with the power of money, it means members of Congress focus more on their donors' wishes than that of those constituents, according to Nick Branner, founder of the Movement for the People's Party, the New People's Party, and former Bernie 2016 staffer. So it was fairly obvious who I should turn to when I wanted to discuss inequality. That would be inequality.org, a program managed by the Institute of Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., a think tank, and who I have written articles for in the past. So I spoke to Sam Pizzigati, Associate Fellow of the Institute of Policy Studies and co-editor of inequality.org, as well as the author of a 2018 book, The Case for a Maximum Wage. I started by asking Sam, why are high incomes a problem?
Well, it's high incomes are a big problem when some people have high incomes and other people don't. In other words, when we have inequality. When we let income and wealth concentrate at the summit of our economic order, we're asking for trouble as a society. We're asking for trouble economically, politically, and culturally as well. And what we've seen over the past 40 years is that there's been a real steepening of inequality, both in the United States and in the rest of the developed world.
Tell us a bit more, how it affects those at the bottom.
Let's look politically first. In a democracy, the idea of a basic democracy is that people get together and debate and discuss their common problems and come to a solution. That's what democracy is supposed to be all about. But in a deeply unequal place, in a society where some people have phenomenally more income and wealth than other people, then people don't face the same problems. Rich people face a set of problems much, much different from everybody else. And the problem is that in a deeply unequal society like the United States, and less so like the UK and the rest of the developed world, those rich people have the power to bend the political process to their needs. So we have political systems in deeply unequal countries that address the problems of rich people and essentially ignore the problems of their average, everyday people.
So the rich are getting what they want on the political agenda, and the poor are effectively being ignored.
And not just the poor. We're talking about the vast majority of people in deeply unequal countries face a political system that is really not responsive at all to their needs.
So how would you actually define excessive income?
Well, if we let's put this in terms of what happens in the economy. what happens within the corporations that dominate our economies. Back in the 1960s and early 1970s, the typical CEO at a major corporation made 20 to 25 times more than the typical workers in those companies. Now, as late as 1980, it was 30 to 1. Now it's about 350 to 1 in the United States. So we've seen a vast upsurge in the income that goes to the top of our corporate order. It's increased. The gap between the top and everyone else has increased about tenfold. That, I would say, is excessive inequality.
So how did incomes get so high?
Well, a couple things happened. In the middle of the 20th century in the United States, we had a much more equal society, and there were two institutional guarantors of that greater inequality. One was the progressive tax system. Income in the 1950s, income over $400,000 in the United States was subject to a 91% top marginal tax rate. That tax rate stayed went down to 70% and stayed there until 1981. That sort of tax rate discouraged high pay because corporate boards essentially said, why pay more? The government is just going to tax it away. So that was one factor. The second institutional factor was a strong trade union movement. In the middle of the 20th century, 1/3 of the U.S. workforce was unionized, and that actually meant that non-union companies that compete in the labor pool had to pay better salaries. So that kept the gap low as well. Now, less than 8% of the U.S. private sector workforce is unionized. So we have no steeply progressive tax system in the United States today, and we have no serious strong trade union movement in the United States. Both those factors have combined to send CEO pay soaring.
So how can it be fixed?
Well, I think, some people say, well, let's just go back to the middle of the 20th century. Let's put a steeply progressive tax system back in place. And the problem is that system that we had in the middle of the 20th century couldn't be sustained. It couldn't be sustained because traditional progressive taxation, as traditionally structured, has a basic flaw, and that is traditionally structured progressive tax systems create a political asymmetry. And that is, let me explain that in those systems, if you have a 90% top rate or 70% top rate, people affected by that top rate, the super rich, have an intense personal interest in knocking that top rate down. If they chop off 5 percentage points off a 90% top rate or 3 percentage points off a 70% top rate, they can save tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even in terms of super rich, even millions of dollars off their taxes. So they have this intense personal interest in fighting and knocking down, in weakening the steeply progressive tax system. Average folks, on the other hand, don't have that intense personal interest in keeping top rates high. So you have the passion on the side of the super rich and more indifference on the part of everybody else, everybody else only sees an indirect benefit from high taxes on the rich. And when you have that sort of political asymmetry, the rich are always going to win. And that's what happened after the middle of the 20th century. The rich kept pounding and pounding and pounding on the progressive tax system until they knocked it down. So because of that, I don't think we can just repeat what we did in the middle of the 20th century. We need to structure progressive taxation in a different way. And I think one way we could do that, the basic way we could do that, is link top incomes to incomes at the bottom. to essentially set our progressive tax rates as a multiple of our lowest tax rates. So setting in almost a maximum wage as linked to a minimum wage. And that way, if we took that sort of approach, then the very rich would have a different incentive structure. They would have an incentive to raise the incomes of society's weakest and most vulnerable, because the more the people at the bottom could made, then the more the rich could make. So I think that linkage, creating a link between top and bottom, is the key to moving forward. And we can start doing that by looking at our governmental policy, tax policy towards corporations.
A lot of high incomes are related to the share price. Obviously, to maximize your income, you've got to get the share price high, therefore you've got to cut costs. So this is the sort of dilemma then that's being faced at the moment. That's right. And when we look at the super rich in the United States, top 1/10 of 1%, 60% of those people owe their economic good fortune to their executive roles in big corporations or banks. So if we look at containing pay, of linking pay at the top, at the bottom, in those big corporations and banks, we'd be making a major move against inequality. Are you saying that the high pay would be related to the level of low pay? Therefore, it's in the interest of those taking the decisions to increase low pay. And then would that affect the sort of corporate tax rate as well in terms of the corporate income tax? What's happening now at the state level in the United States, and there are moves to make this happen at the federal level as well. What's happening is that we have a push for legislation that links the tax system, that links the government procurement system, that links the government subsidy system to the ratio of CEO to median worker pay. And actually, one political jurisdiction in the United States has actually moved and put this into effect. The city of Portland in Oregon, as of 2018, subjects corporations with wide gaps between executive and worker pay to higher tax rates than corporations with modest gaps between worker and chief executive pay. Half a dozen U.S. states have legislation to this effect now pending, and there's actually a bill in the U.S. Congress to the same goal. So there is some movement to get an improvement in this situation. Yes, and I think this is what we call the new pay ratio politics, and it's starting to gain traction. What can we, the people, do to make these things happen, to help move this forward a bit quicker? Well, I think there are a number of things that people can do. The first is to urge lawmakers to start promoting and fighting for legislation that denies our tax dollars to any companies that pay their top executives outrageously more than they pay their workers. So those bills, that legislation I just mentioned, getting that legislation introduced in your state or your nation, I think is a prime move to make. But we can also fight for pay ratios on our own in our communities, in our workplaces. Workers can bring demands for modest pay ratios between top and bottom to the collective bargaining table. Those of us who support nonprofit enterprises, some of which pay their top executives phenomenally well, we can insist that organizations that want our donations keep their pay ratios between top and bottom staff at a modest level. Students at universities could demand students and faculty at universities could demand that their institutions keep a reasonable ratio between their top president's salary and their lowest paid worker pay. So in whatever
whatever sort of environment we are, we can push for decent, for reasonable, for modest top to bottom pay ratios. I think we need to work like that and create a more egalitarian ethos in our nations and in our communities.
That seems to make a lot of sense, Sam. So you've outlined most of this in your book, The Case for a Maximum Wage. Is that right?
Yes. It talks about this in much more detail.
Excellent. I think that's absolutely terrific. Thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you.
That's Sam Pizzigati, Associate Fellow of the Institute of Policy Studies and the co-editor of inequality.org, which you can sign up to for a regular weekly update. He's also the author of The Case for a Maximum Wage, a copy of which I have here. Apologies during that interview for a couple of notification pings that went off. Also, apologies for the poor quality and low volume on one side of that call, which was conducted on Skype. The use of marginal tax rate as a tool to reduce income inequality was outlined in episode 17 of The Real Agenda, when we spoke to Professor Danny Dorlin from the University of Oxford. Danny said that most effective strategy to reduce income inequality was to have a high marginal rate of tax, not to raise more money, but to deter greed. Sam agrees, but feels that such a tool, though effective, is not sustainable, as the power of big money seeks to change the system back to their favour, and the less well-off are more complacent about this. Sam suggests that we focus on pay ratios. This way, any raises in senior executive pay could only happen if they raised the income of their lower-paid workers to ensure top-to-bottom pay ratios were not so extreme. So it seems to me that a combination of both tactics could help to reduce income inequality. Fortunately, these proposals have been receiving more traction recently, when the new Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez appeared on America's iconic TV show 60 Minutes and had the temerity to suggest that the US tax code ought to subject annual income over $10 million to the 70% tax rate, which was once considered just plain mainstream common sense. Reactions to Ocasio-Cortez's appearance came fast and furious. Progressives cheered. Conservative heads, notes Michael Hiltzik in the Los Angeles Times, simply exploded. Well, let's hope we can build on these initiatives to bring a fairer society not driven by greed. So that's the show for this month. Thanks for listening, America. Coming soon, we're going to look at universal healthcare, or rather the lack of it. Why America has failed to provide a service to all its people, which most other Western countries have worked out how to do at half the cost. It can be done, and everyone will be better off. That's coming up soon on The Real Agenda, the podcast of political change. If you'd like to subscribe to the show, then do email us at tom@realagendaradio.org, and we welcome your comments and ideas. For more info, go to realagendaradio.org. And by the way, we are looking for contributors and correspondents across America, though of course particularly in DC, so do email us if you're interested in being part of the show, especially so you don't just get a guy with a British accent telling you how you should run the country. Special thanks to our sponsors, Reverse Media Group, one of the fastest growing search and media companies. Find out why at reversemediagroup.com. One thing is certain, people want to see a change to a more compassionate and caring society. It's not happening, but it can. It's up to you. That's The Real Agenda. I'm Tom Burgess. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.